Let's start with the war. I'm going to give you a lot to work on here with oil and gas and wind and solar and transmission. But it all really comes down to the breakdown of the support structures that make everything else possible. That's what you're going to be wrestling with. What you've got on the right here is a population density map of the Russian space. North is to the right, so if you tilt your head, that's fine. That orange V going from Central Europe into Central Siberia, that's where everybody lives. If you go to the left map, same zone, but now instead of population density, it's an economic and climate map. And on that left map, the green is the Russian wheat belt. That's where you live if you live in Russia. The weather is atrocious. You get about 20 hours of sunlight for the entire month of December, based on where you are. Cold, low productivity per acre. And when you don't get a lot of income from a wide swath of territory, infrastructure is impossible to build. So Russia, even today, does not have a national road network. You want to move stuff? It's rail or nothing. If you go to the right, to the blue, to the north, that's Tundra and Tagai. Nobody lives there. You go to the left, to the yellow, to the south, that's desert. No one lives there. Now, when Russians look at this, they get really depressed. Not so much by the blue or the yellow or the green, but the beige. Territories that are not economically viable, but aren't really barriers either. Territories where it's really easy to shove a Panzer division or a Mongol horde through. And since they're not mobile within their own territories, what has happened 50-odd times in their history is someone has crossed the beige into the green and they just rampage until Russia's weather defeats them. That's the typical Russian story. So what the Russians have always tried to do is to push out of the green, past the beige, until they can reach these geographic blocking points. The Carpathian Mountains, the Alma-Ata Mountains, the deserts of the Karakum. If they can do that, geography helps with their defense, a forward defense. And then they forward station static troops, because they're not mobile, in the access points between those barriers. 50-odd invasions, all of them have come through one of these access points. Now, today, the Russians are a little depressed because at the Soviet height, they controlled all those access points. When the Soviet system collapsed, they only controlled one. And everything that Putin has done in the last 22 years in his foreign policy has been about rebuilding those military footprints in those blue arcs. This is the Crimea War, the Georgia War, the Nagorno War, the Kazakh intervention. Ukraine is just unfortunate to be on the path to 2 of those access points. So it's not that the Russians won't stop until they have all of Ukraine. It's that the Russians won't stop when they have all of Ukraine. We're only in like stage 4 or 5 of a 9-part plan here. Where are my Texans? It's not as big as you think. Just the scale of what the Russians are attempting here boggles the mind. I mean, from their core populations around Moscow, they've got to cross 2 Texans to get to where they need to go. That's big. Okay, here's where we are right now. The deep red are the territories the Russians controlled on the first day of the war. These are territories they grabbed back in the Donbass War of 2014. The pinkish areas are the territories they controlled on the first of this month. As you may have noticed, a lot of crap's gone down in the last few weeks. Now, the original Ukrainian plan was to move on these 2 bridges. These are the only 2 bridges that connect that sliver. Can I point this? Yeah, there. Oh, never mind. I'll just go point. The 2 bridges are the only parts of infrastructure that connect southern Ukraine to this chunk of occupied territory west of the Dnieper River. Only those 2. And so what the Ukrainians have been doing is thinking that if they damage those bridges so they can't be used for heavy equipment, which they've done, then any Russian troops north of them are going to be fighting on their own. Difficult to reinforce, difficult to evacuate. So they advertised for 2.5 months that this was imminent. And the Russians moved about 20,000 troops from other parts of the front to this zone, knowing that they were going to need more bodies and pre-positioned equipment in order to fight off that assault. That assault started 2 weeks ago. What the Ukrainians then did is looked at where the Russians pulled their troops from over here in the east and hit that hard. And that's where the front collapsed. That's Kharkiv province. And everything between those 2 areas is now back in Ukrainian hands. Now, let me give you a little bit of the backstory for the war to this point so you can understand the significance of this and what it means moving forward. You guys remember the assault on Kiev in the first week of the war when there was that 40-mile long convoy of forces? You guys remember how on the third day of the war the convoy stalled out because they forgot fuel? And on the seventh day, all the soldiers dismounted and walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. Now, everyone took their own lessons from this. The NATO lesson was that the Russians are incapable of fighting a modern combined war conflict. They are incompetent at operating above a post-World War II level of technology, which means if we have a direct NATO-Russia fight, they'll be obliterated. But the Russians see this as a fight for their existential survival. So all tools are on the table. So if the Russians do succeed in conquering Ukraine, they will then come for Romania, Poland, and the rest, NATO allies, and nukes will be their only option. So NATO is sending every possible weapon system that we can to the Ukrainians that they can use as fast as they can learn to use them, because we have to kill the Russian war machine in Ukraine. This is where Russia's future is decided. This is where NATO's future is decided, in Ukraine. We can't have a direct fight. It's got to be the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians and the Russians took different lessons. The Ukrainians had a national consolidation around the defeat at Kiev and have been kicking some serious since. The Russians now realize that their propaganda was just that propaganda, and the Ukrainians are never going to welcome them in. And if the Ukrainians are not wayward Russians who are going to come back into the fold, they are the enemy. And so the policy of genocide started. And the Russians began advancing slowly, no more than a mile a day, behind an unfaltering wave of artillery bombardment. And in 2 months, they fired over 2.5 million shells, which is about how many were fired in a year in World War II. The goal is simple. Target every single piece of civilian infrastructure you see to make the land uninhabitable. And that way the population self-selects into two groups. Group 1 runs. They become refugees. You never have to worry about them again. Group 2 are fighters, and you can kill them on sight. So once the army moves forward, the Wagner group, the mercenaries, and the Chechen forces come in and just cleanse the area. We don't have firm numbers because very little of the territory even now has been liberated, but best guess is about 250,000 Ukrainians have been kidnapped and taken to Siberia, mostly children. And at least that many, again, have been killed. Again, we just don't know. We do know from German radio intercepts that the atrocities that were uncovered at Bucha after the Kiev withdrawal and at Izmain after the Kharkiv withdrawal are only 2 of about 90 examples of what has happened in occupied territory so far. It's gotten to the point that the United Nations and various NGOs have literally run out of staff to investigate the war crimes that they've already found in just the first week after the liberation in Izmain. The Russians are not making any effort to hide it. Okay, that's where we are right now.